Hello there. So today we're going to be looking at chapter 14 in your theme 4 booklet, which is Making Markets Work. And this is all about supply side policies. So first and foremost, I'd like just to give some thought to recap of some of your year one work. So what is meant by the term supply side policy? Write down 3 different types of supply side policies and then research some of the recent supply side policies implemented by the UK government. Well, to some degree, we'll be looking at that through the course of this presentation. But if it's something that you'd like to do, then please, by all means, do so. Okay, so first things first then. I'm just going to change the light slightly because at the moment there appears to be a bit of an issue with that. So hold on a minute. Oh, blimey, that's making it worse. How's that? That's better, I think. I'll try and sit away from that. There we go. Eventually. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so macroeconomic policies and the impact on firms and individuals. And in this case, we're looking specifically at supply side policies. So what are we going to look at then? We're going to look at the following things. We're going to look at market-based and interventionist methods. Okay, so in some cases, if we're talking about free market and allowing the market to allocate resources in a certain way, that would be considered to be market-based supply-side policies. But there are also interventionist policies. So they are things like government influence and intervention within the economy. So each of those attempt to try to increase incentives to some degree, promote competition, reform the labour market in some cases, improve the skills and quality of the labour force, and improve the infrastructure that an economy has. And we're also going to look at the way in which we can show some of these supply side policies in terms of how they might affect AD or AS to show the way in which they might function and help to achieve certain changes. I suppose the supply side policies tend to factor on improving the factors of production. And if you remember the 4 factors of production, the supply side policies are generally all about trying to improve the quality of those factors or the quantity of those factors available, as we'll see as we go through this. We'll look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of supply side policies, and also we should take a look at the potential conflicts, policy conflicts that might be facing policymakers when they're trying to apply these policies. So let's take a look. Sorry, I'll keep moving myself around. I'll move myself over there, and hopefully that'll keep me out of the way. Oh, go up there. Actually, that's probably slightly better. A definition then. Supply side policy. What is it? It's a policy that seeks to improve the long-run productive potential of the economy. So it's important to bear in mind that in the long run, we are attempting to increase the overall productive potential of the economy, and that will allow us to create greater amounts of output. And obviously, if we do that, then that's then going to lead to economic growth and hopefully economic development as we go. So in terms of supply side policy goals then, and we've mentioned that in the long term, we're looking for extra growth. We want a country to have some sort of growth, long-term growth potential, and a successful supply side policy will essentially shift our country's production possibility frontier or production possibility curve from where it is, from being able to produce at a certain level, either consumer goods or capital goods, and actually to shift that out to the right, so increase the overall productive potential of our economy. And that's the principle behind any sort of supply side policy, to try to actually extend that outwards, so that we as a country can actually produce more and hopefully sell more and then be more successful as an economy. So let's look at market-based versus interventionist-based supply-side policies then. And in each instance, like we've mentioned before, supply-side policies are all about trying to improve the quantity or the quality of the factors of production. So let's take a look at the 2 categories then. Obviously, we've got market-based or free market supply-side policies. and we'll look at some of those as we go. So these really aim to try to make labour and product markets more flexible and efficient by reducing government involvement and interference. So effectively, we don't want any intervention. We don't want, if we believe in the free market and free market supply side policies, it's about improving or aiming to make both labour and product markets more flexible. Okay, rather than being interfered with by the government. And then we've got interventionist supply side policies, and that's essentially where the government has a role to play in the efficient operation of markets. And we've talked about some of the reasons why that might have been, to avoid negative externalities, or also to avoid market failure. And to be fair, in most instances, a combination of both market-based and interventionist-based supply-side policies tend to work best when we look at both sides and try and create some harmony between the two. So let's have a look at some options then. Here we go. So first things first, to increase incentives, we could actually look at cutting income tax. And what that would do essentially would create an incentive for more people to work, and that hopefully is then going to expand the labour force. So if we cut income tax, that means that anybody who's in a job is going to have to pay less in tax, and that clearly should be an incentive for them to want to work or to work harder, because they're going to keep more of the money that they earn rather than giving it to the taxman. To some degree, that could actually also influence economically inactive people to enter the workforce, the labour force, and that's clearly then going to boost output, because if we've got more people willing to enter into the labour market, if there are jobs available, that clearly is then going to boost our economic output. Other things that we can do, we can cut corporation tax. So income tax is very much based on individuals who work for other companies. They don't work for themselves. But corporation tax is basically where we're trying to encourage the profit motive of firms, which can then be reinvested in capital, equipment, and improvements in the way in which products and services are produced and serviced in a sense. So that clearly, corporation tax at the moment is at 18-19%, I think. And obviously, if we cut corporation tax, that's going to encourage more firms to actually hopefully perform well and make a profit, because essentially they then don't have to pay as much of their profits in taxes, and they should then be using that hopefully to reinvest in their business and make it even more efficient and successful. We can look at modifications in welfare payments. In some cases, we might think about widening the gap between benefits and wages to boost work incentives. Okay, so clearly, if there's very little difference between living on benefits and the wage that you can earn, then clearly there's not such a great incentive to work. Whereas if we modify the welfare payments system to help that process, it should then encourage more people to work rather than stay at home and live off benefits, for want of a better term. Investment grants is another example. So offering incentives to invest in capital, so capital investment like improving machinery or using greater tech to try and improve the overall productive capacity of each individual firm. So investment grants are another type of supply side policy that can be considered. And in some cases, you also get regional policy. This tends to be where the government will set up and provide incentives for firms to set up in depressed areas where maybe there's been long-standing unemployment, or there's been some structural unemployment caused by shutting down of various industries in certain parts of the country. So regional policy is designed to try to improve, I suppose, re-energize depressed regions in different parts of the country. And then there are also subsidies, so creating incentives for firms to produce more. So if you subsidize, if you offer a subsidy, essentially you're offering an incentive for firms to produce more. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the ways in which we can make these changes or try and encourage these changes in a little bit more detail. So One of the things that we could do is reduce marginal tax rates. Now, clearly, that's to do with creating incentives for workers to increase the number of hours that they might work. Now, national insurance contributions are a part of that, and that's a direct tax that we pay, and that helps to pay for state benefits like state pension and the job seekers allowance, or the universal credit, as an example. Now, in this instance, then, that marginal tax rate is basically the percentage of tax that's paid on an additional £1 of earnings. If we've got a progressive tax regime, the marginal tax rate will increase as income increases. And if we think about that, think about the way in which we talked about tax allowances and also the levels of tax within this country, it does tend to go up, and the percentage of tax goes up with the amount of income, as the amount of income increases. So looking at 2016 income tax rates were as follows. So personal allowance of 11,000, basic rate tax of 20% from 11,000 to 43,000, higher tax rate of 40% on anything that you earn from 43,000 up to 150,000, and then an additional rate of 45% for anything that anybody earns over 150,000. Now, clearly, in some cases, that changes on a fairly regular basis. So that 2016 figure has changed significantly now, in that now we're in 2021, aren't we? So the personal allowance figure is 12,500, for instance, and also the basic rate tax of 20%, I think, goes up to now for around about 50,000 rather than the 43. So they're constantly changing, and in this case, the government is trying to encourage individuals by putting more money in their pockets, and hopefully that's then encouraging them to spend more money on consumption. Now, also, the national, not only do we pay income tax, we also pay national insurance contributions, and these are normally as a percentage of your earnings. Okay, so for anybody that's earning between £672 and £3,532 per month, they will pay national insurance contributions of around about 12% per month. Okay, so in addition to your 20-odd% or however many percent tax you pay on any earnings, you also pay 12% of that of your earnings in national insurance as well. And it's 2% in addition to that 12% for any earnings over 3,532 a month. Okay, now, I think again this is based on 2016 figures, and those rates do tend to vary. Also, not so much the rates as such, but certainly the levels that we're talking about here. So let's have a look at some supply side further policy options then. To promote competition, we talked about a number of things that we can use to try to encourage improvements in supply side. Well, clearly promoting competition can be a good thing. One of the things that we can do, one of the things that the government can do, is to deregulate markets to encourage more competition. So if you're opening markets up to freer competition, that's going to remove barriers to entry and should actually help to drive productivity gains and boost supply. So deregulating what used to be a market that was maybe in the public sector, and then you're bringing it into the private sector, or encouraging competition into those markets. That clearly is going to hopefully improve the supply side of the economy. Privatisation can also be used, so that's where essentially state control is removed, or in some cases, so the water companies used to be nationalised companies. They're now been privatised. The Royal Mail is another example. British Petroleum was originally a nationalised company. It's now privatised, and so part of the reason for privatising is that, again, encouraging this deregulation, competition into markets that traditionally were monopoly scenarios. Again, it's about trying to take inefficiencies of monopoly environments where you might have lack of innovation, lack of choice, and high prices, and some consumer exploitation, That was designed, privatisation was designed to try and minimise that and improve the overall efficiency of some of the previously state-owned industries. Tends to have been pursued by Conservative governments, generally speaking, to privatise key areas of the economy in order to drive more efficiency. So let's take a look at other areas as well then that can be used. We could look at reforming the labour market, and in some cases that's done to try to encourage more people to come into work. So one of the things has been the reformation of trade unions, and that's involved reducing trade union power, which could potentially give rise to lower wage rises, and that could feed through into lower inflation and more labour market flexibility. So effectively, again, tends to have been the Conservative governments of recent years. They have been quite keen to try to reduce trade union power in order to give employers a little bit more flexibility, and also to try and encourage more people back into work. Other things that you can do, you could provide incentives to work for, such as lower marginal tax rates, maybe supplying accommodation in high areas such as London, where you might have key workers that can't afford some of the high housing costs, and so that's used in order to incentivise people to come and work in some of the more expensive areas in the UK. We can also look at improving skills, quality and quantity of the labour force, and there's a number of ways in which we can do that. One is obviously through training and education. Clearly, with that should improve productivity in terms of training, and also mobility and flexibility of the workforce, possibly through education, but also giving people transferable skills and the ability and the flexibility to be a bit more resilient maybe, and also to think, well, I need to move somewhere or upskill in order to effectively improve my chances of getting a good job and getting well paid. So those are all things that can be done through training and education. Immigration is another way in which we could improve the quantity of the labour force. So obviously it could also improve the quality if we're talking about skilled workers, and that can be used to improve the skills base of an economy too. But as I've mentioned before, it can also mean that we bring a greater quantity of people into the workforce, and that could be used to fill vacancies in certain economies, or to help cut costs through low wages, because maybe some of the people who are coming to this country may have lower expectations in terms of the wages that they expect to receive for the jobs that they do. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of case studies then. We've talked briefly about income tax and in some cases like some cuts. So let's have a look at how we might be able to encourage the supply side of the economy through income tax cuts. So we've talked about the fact that the UK has what's known as a progressive tax system, and that means as incomes rise, the greater proportion of income tax an individual pays. And these are based on 2015, 2016, and then 2016, 2017 rates. So you can see that we've got different rates of tax at different levels of salary, and obviously we've also got this personal tax allowance, which is basically the amount of money that individuals can earn without having to pay any tax in the first instance. Okay, so these are changing consistently. I wouldn't say constantly, but if you think about in this instance, if we increase the personal tax allowance, that means that more people more people receive more money that they don't have to pay tax on. So that's going to mean they've got more disposable income, and hopefully that will have an impact on the amount of spending that they do. So as I mentioned, the table just shows the figures for 2016, 2017, and also 2015, 2016. Okay, I'd like to just go and find out what the current tax rate bands are, and the personal allowances, because they are changing on a fairly regular basis. I think, as I mentioned, the the personal tax allowance now at the moment is £12,500. So you can earn £12,500 before you pay any tax. But go and take a look at the bands. Not so much the tax rates haven't changed. They're still 20, 40, and 45, but certainly the bands between which those 20, 40, or 45 percent tax are applicable have. And again, posing a question for you: what impact do you think that an increase in the personal tax allowance and an increase in the salary band on the 20% and 40% rate will have on the labour market? So that's a question for you to consider. And also thinking about that, how do you think, to what extent would this improve the functioning of the labour market and the supply side of the economy? What would you change and why would you do it? And what sort of impact do you think your decisions may have? So that's something that you could discuss or think about yourselves, and have that as a bit of an example that you might be able to use in any answers that you might need to come up with as far as income tax and supply side policies is concerned. Okay, another example is 0 hours contracts. Here in this case, we've got an example of how many scenarios there are, and this is around about 2015. So where you've got a number of the length of employment and also the number of 0 hours contracts. You can see that the number of contracts and 0 hours contracts has changed significantly over time, and you can see that the number of those contracts that are less than 12 months is outshining and outrunning all of the others. And to some degree, you could argue that the fact that those have risen to such a large degree is down to a number of things. Okay, we can see from the article here, 0 hours contracts have risen to 903,000 workers. Okay, so significant amount of people on 0 hours contracts. Now, you could argue that to some degree they are very useful for the employer, but not quite so useful and not quite so good for the employee. Now, the employee, in some certain instances, maybe employees are quite happy to have 0 hours contracts, but it doesn't guarantee them a certain amount of income, and it allows labour market flexibility as far as the employer is concerned, but it doesn't necessarily give any sort of security or any benefit to the employee, and that's something to bear in mind. Okay, you could argue it makes for more flexible labour markets, and to some degree it was probably encouraged certainly when we were going through significant recessionary periods. Another example here then is UK corporation tax rates. So 3 different things that might actually encourage more investment or changes in the labour market. But in this instance, if we're talking about UK corporation rates, we can see that back in 1973-74, corporation tax rates in 1973 were over 50%. So you can see there has been a significant fall. Around about late 80s, there's a significant fall from the height of 50%, dropped around about the late 80s to about 35%, but it's continued to fall, and that's partly down to incentives that the government have put in, subsequent governments have put in place to try to encourage more businesses to, number one, stay in this country and work in this country, and actually also for them to keep more of their profits rather than pay it all in tax. So clearly, one of the things that we can look at in terms of this downward trend, tax would corporation tax would fall by to 17% by 2020, with a long-term plan of reducing it to 15%. I think we're a little bit higher than 17% at the moment. I think it might be 18 or 19. So we've not quite achieved that. But whether that long-term plan will carry on and it will reduce to 15% is, a bit of a question. And clearly there might be some drawbacks to this in terms of some of the impacts that it might have. Okay, so I'd like to give that some thought too. Okay, let's have a look at some of the microeconomic effects of supply side policies then. So we've talked about the macroeconomic effects and trying to increase the overall productive capacity of the economy, but in some cases these supply side policies can also have some microeconomic effects, so effects on individuals, firms and other economic agents. So if we have successful and effective supply side policies, there can be some microeconomic benefits as well, such as an improvement in the flexibility and strength of the labour market, which obviously is going to mean that individual firms will have greater choice of labour. Hopefully, if they're more flexible and they've got improved skills, then that's obviously going to benefit individual firms as well as it is the overall macro economy. Could also improve competitiveness within product markets. You think about some of the other things that might happen in terms of supply side policies, improvements in infrastructure and transportation and communications, and also if we think about some of the improvements in terms of training and education, and also more investment by businesses, that could hopefully improve the competitiveness within product markets. Hopefully higher levels of innovation within product markets where we're getting more competition happening in different markets. Then clearly one of the things that we can do through investment and the use of better more efficient technology, maybe we can also look at higher levels of innovation in turn and research and development within product markets. And that's going to give greater efficiency and productivity for firms. And hopefully that means that they're going to be more competitive and more successful. If they are more successful, they sell more and they can control their costs. That means they're going to achieve more profit, and that means that more profit will go to the government in taxes. And so it's a win-win situation both for individual firms but also for the government too. So some of the macroeconomic effects of supply side policies then. So clearly they are very high, they're a high number, and they cover all areas of the economy. So one thing is that clearly if we get it right, if we get our supply side policies right, that's going to mean lower levels of unemployment and a lower natural rate of unemployment. And if we can achieve that, low rates of unemployment mean that the government doesn't have to pay quite so much of its tax revenue in welfare benefits. And overall, if we got a better economy, we've got more resilience within the economy through some of the supply side policies that we put in place, that should mean, generally speaking, lower natural rates of unemployment. It should also allow us to improve our international competitiveness. So if we're improving the overall efficiency of our production techniques and also improving the level of goods and services that we're producing and doing it at a cheaper price, then maybe we can become more internationally competitive, which obviously is going to lead to more exports, and that's going to help to sort out some of the balance of payments issues that we face. If we get higher, if we've got successful supply side policies in place, well, that's going to mean higher rates of long run economic growth, and that's going to lead to improved living standards. So effectively, if we get high rates of economic growth, that should also lead to economic development too. And I mean, we could achieve greater flexibility within the economy to withstand economic shocks. So again, if we do get external shocks, if we've got some resilience built in through improved macroeconomic conditions based on the supply side policies we put in place, that hopefully is going to build in some resilience to our economy too. And it's also softer inflationary pressures, because if our long run aggregate supply is increasing, that's going to reduce capacity constraints. So as a result of that, if we've got high levels of capacity in the economy, that's going to mean that probably where inflation will be not quite so much of a problem, and we'll demonstrate that when we look at a few of these diagrams later on in the presentation. Okay, right on cue. Here's an example then of the supply side effects of monetary policy. So in this instance, what we're trying to do now, and I'm just going to move myself down here a minute so that we can actually see that slightly better. I might need to move myself again, I think, but we'll see. So in this instance then, looking at the supply side effects of monetary policy, okay? So clearly monetary policy, depending on whether it's expansionary or contractionary, is going to have an influence on aggregate demand. And that is clearly also going to, and it can in some cases also influence long run aggregate supply too. Let's just take a look at a scenario and see how this might work, okay? So let's assume in this case that the monetary policy is going to be expansionary. There's been a cut in interest rates. That's going to stimulate business investment into capital equipment to improve efficiency and productivity, and that will cause a shift in LRIS to LRIS1, as can be seen here. Okay, so we'd have a rightward shift of our long-run aggregate supply curve, and that would essentially improve the overall capacity of the economy. Now you can see in this situation where we've got this investment, which is a component of AD, not only will that cause long-run aggregate supply to improve, but also it's also going to mean that we've got an increase in aggregate demand too. Okay. Now in this instance, you can see that our productive capacity has increased. So it was originally in the first instance at FE, as we can see here. That was the point at which we were performing in the first instance at full employment. Okay, so where one of the factors of production is at full capacity. So in this instance, what we've done is moved from FE to FE1. Our productive capacity has increased, and AD aggregate demand also can feed through into higher growth in terms of output, and then also employment, because more people will be needed to do the jobs to be able to satisfy the demand for extra goods and services. Okay, and you can see in this case that's been done because we've had a shift in LRIS, an outward shift in LRIS, in addition to an increase in aggregate demand. The actual price level of those goods, because of the improvement in the economic efficiency and the productive capacity, has not been particularly inflationary. There's been no change in the price level in this instance. Okay, so that's quite a nice example of demonstrating how a particular type of monetary policy might have a supply side effect. Let's take a look at if we've got an expansionary supply side policy then. Okay, so in this situation, okay, if the economy is running up against capacity constraints, the government might decide to implement a certain type of supply side policy. So if we are getting to this point where effectively we're very close to full employment, okay, so that means that we haven't got a great deal of extra productive capacity within the economy as it stands at the moment. So let's take a look at what we might choose to do then. Okay, so the government might choose to invest, for example, into training and education, and that should boost LRIS as it stands to LRIS1. So effectively, again, we've got this increase in our productive capacity, and you can see in that scenario what that will do is it has a positive effect on inflation, because as you can see now, effectively we've increased our overall productive capacity, but if you look at the aggregate demand, that basically has caused essentially the demand has increased, but because we can produce at a higher level and in a more efficient way, then effectively the price has fallen. So that has a positive effect on inflation as the price level moves from P to P1. Not only that, we've also enhanced economic growth, because in this instance we've moved from initially initial capacity or initial output at Y, where we had our equilibrium point between long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand being Y, and at price P. Effectively, what's happened in this instance is that we've actually increased our productive capacity too. Okay, so we've created employment, and effectively our productive capacity has also increased. Now, again, I'll just move myself up here a minute so we can see in this situation the last point to make, where we've got a more highly skilled workforce, that's going to improve the competitiveness of UK exports, in terms of the fact that we've got better quantity and quality of staff, and that's hopefully going to mean we're going to get greater competitiveness. That means, as a result of that, because we've got more exports being sold, that essentially, I'm going to sneeze in a minute. I'll try and stop it if I can. That means that we're also going to get an improvement in the balance of payments on the current account too. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Let's have a look at some strengths and weaknesses then. Is supply side policy effective? Well, it very much depends, and this is a familiar story, as you'll have seen if you can remember some of the previous slides that we've been doing. There are always going to be time lags. We mentioned time lags seems to be almost a catch-all for any macroeconomic policy. There is always an issue. There's always going to be some sort of time lag between the policies being implemented and them having any sort of effect. So that's something to bear in mind. Okay, an example: training and education, which is a great thing to do, can take several years to have a full effect on the supply side of the economy. Okay, they tend to be long-term strategies, don't they, to bring some fruit, to bear some fruit. The cost clearly is going to have an impact. Okay, it could be very expensive to implement. If we take HS2 as an example, and I think this was actually produced some time ago. Originally, they thought the cost was going to be 42 billion. I think it's going to be nearly double that. And is the cost justifying the actual activity? And in some cases, you might argue that spending the best part of 100 billion on a high-speed rail link, much as it gives lots and lots of benefits, maybe there are other things that the money could have been spent on, perhaps. Some of the policies of competing nations, clearly that again is going to have an effect on whatever we do. If other things are happening in other parts of the world that are considered to be our main competitors, well, clearly if Germany, the USA, China and a number of others are introducing their own supply side policies, then clearly if ours are more efficient, better, and that then means that we've got some sort of overall competitive advantage from it, then that's all good. But in some instances, we might find that that is not the case. So that's something to bear in mind too. It clearly, if we're hoping for gains in international trade, particularly when we're talking about some of our big competitors and some of those that we do trade significant amounts with, then that might have a bit of an issue too. Might create a bit of an issue too. What about government failure then? Is there any danger of government failure? Well, in some cases, when we think about some of the ways in which government might choose to spend money, have they done it wisely? Have they done it efficiently? Have they, in some ways, due to their lack of rigor or lack of knowledge within a marketplace, perhaps maybe they've actually added to failure rather than market failure, and the government has failed to actually address some of the market failure that it was trying to help out with. And clearly there are lots of instances, lots of examples that we could give where there have been some poorly administered government supply side policies that actually don't quite lead to the desired outcome. Let's have a look at some other things. So we looked at some supply side policy conflicts. Let's take a look at some of the macroeconomic policy conflicts that we might be faced with. Okay, so let's take as an example, the government might want to wish to lower unemployment. So if it does that, it might choose to increase government spending, G, to achieve this. And if it does that, then clearly, as government spending is an element of AD, that would cause AD to move from AD to AD1. Okay, so there would be an outward shift, a rightward shift of the AD curve. That effectively would do a couple of things. One, it has an effect of increasing the real national output. As we can see, it would move from Q at equilibrium to Q1. And that would also create jobs as the economy moves along the SRAS curve. Okay, so effectively there would be more jobs available because there'd be greater demand for goods and services. Okay, however, you can see in this instance that does actually cause a bit of a change in terms of our level of expense and the price level. So the price level in this instance moves from P to P1. So there's some inflationary pressures been created by that change. If we take another example then, where let's assume in this case our economy is at equilibrium at PQ. So in this instance we're talking about P and Q. Okay, so that's where AD is crossing our long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, now in this instance maybe the government would be a little bit concerned about inflation, because at this point here we are fairly close to full employment. And in this instance, as we can see, where the long run aggregate supply curve starts to go vertical, any extra increase in aggregate demand is just going to be inflationary. Okay, so in order to address that inflation issue, it might choose, in this case, to increase taxes in order to reduce consumption. Now, if it's going to increase taxes, that would clearly be a demand side policy, wouldn't it? So it's trying to influence demand, and essentially, in this case, increasing taxes would hopefully reduce consumption. So if that were to be the case, if we have an increase in taxes, that means that basically individuals and firms may be in a position where they have less money in their pockets, and that's going to then cause aggregate demand to fall. Okay, so it will shift to the left from AD to AD1. Now, clearly, that's going to reduce inflationary pressures, because effectively that then reduces our price from P to P1 to our new level of equilibrium, and that clearly would be quite a good thing, because that would actually hopefully address the inflationary pressure that we might have within our economy. However, if consumers have reduced their disposable income, that means they're going to spend less on imports. As we know, all the research tells us that when we have higher levels of disposable income, we tend to spend them. We have a high propensity to buy imported goods. Okay. In that case, clearly, if we have a reduction in our disposable income, that should then reduce the amount we spend on imports, and that would then also improve the balance of payments, the difference between our imports and exports, or exports minus imports, to give us net trade. Okay. However, one of the things we've got to bear in mind is that, again, given some of the things that we might want to do here in terms of reducing inflation, if we actually start to get to a position where AD falls, so that real national output causes real national output and also economic growth to fall too. And clearly, if we have this lower level of aggregate demand, it may well be that firms don't need to produce quite so much, and that could then mean that they might lay off workers because they don't need them, so unemployment could also rise. So we're constantly looking at this issue around macroeconomic policies, supply side policies, having in some cases some really good benefits and actually helping to achieve overall macroeconomic objectives, but in some cases they will also conflict with other macroeconomic objectives that the government might be trying to achieve. Okay, so which objective should we go for? Well, clearly in some cases we might find that one objective may also help to achieve additional objectives. But the problem with that is in some cases we also have objectives that are going to inherently conflict with one another. So we might be wanting to try and to increase overall growth by encouraging more spending, and that clearly economic growth is going to mean greater jobs, and so there's some real good benefits. However, if we try to do that too much, and there's inflationary pressures in the market, then that might mean that causes the government not to be able to achieve its inflation target. So there's always this trade-off and this conflict to try to deal with. And it's quite a nice example in the video that you can watch, which actually looks at macroeconomic objectives and policy in a bit more detail, and how the government of the Bank of England tries to balance that with some of the policies that he's trying to encourage. Clearly, in some cases, the government is going to have to make some priority decisions. Which objective is the most important? And more often than not, it's a case of excuse me, a bit of a trade-off between, in this case, policy conflicts and let's look at economic growth as an example, and negative externalities as the sort of trade-off, if you like. So let's first and foremost, let's just remind ourselves what negative externalities are. Basically, costs and benefits to a third party created by economic agents when undertaking their activities. So in this instance, clearly that would be a significant cost, wouldn't it? So pollution as an example. If we're talking about that, the long-term impact on the environment of economic growth could be through pollution, through global warming, through too much CO2 emissions being too high. That could obviously cause a significant issue. The other thing could be overusing scarce resources, and obviously with some of the resources we're talking about, where they're finite once they've been used, that's it, they're used, and they will never be replaced. There is also the potential for an increase in the consumption of demerit goods, and these are all things that we would need to bear in mind when we're talking about trying to encourage economic growth. Maybe that's then going to mean, because more people have got more money available, they might choose to spend that money not that wisely, maybe on demerit goods in some cases. It's also going to bearing in mind economic growth tends to favour those people that have already got income or wealth, or significant amounts of income and wealth. That all that's going to do is exacerbate the gap between those that have and those that have not. So that's also something to bear in mind. And then also work-life balance. Clearly, economic growth is a good thing, but if we are constantly working and not really considering our health or the work-life balance, then that clearly can have all sorts of implications for society as time goes on. And what's the opportunity cost of growth? What else could we be doing? How else could we be spending those resources? Is it always about economic growth? We tend to sort of spend a lot of time talking about economic growth being a good thing, but clearly there are some drawbacks to it too, and we need to balance those when we come to trying to make decisions. So other examples then, in this case, conflicts between fiscal and supply side policies then. Okay, so the government can choose to increase its spending in order to pay for merit goods in areas such as education and health. Okay, and that clearly can have a massive impact and a positive impact, but it could also have an impact on private sector supply. So if the government chooses to spend a load of money on that particular area, then that probably means that the private sector will choose not to do so. Okay, so essentially what happens in that situation is the private sector gets crowded out of that particular. So instead of investing in a particular sector, because the government's already doing it, the private sector might choose not to do so. For the reasons we've just explained. Excuse me. Now, one could argue that if the public sector is doing some of these things, that might actually, and it's having to borrow money in order to do that, might actually essentially reduce the supply of funds available to the private sector, and that could potentially push up interest rates as well. When we're talking about this conflict between fiscal and supply side policies, we could find that in some cases we might get bottlenecks in production processes as firms can't cope with the increase in demand brought about by government expenditure. And if that happens, then effectively we're slowing down supply, and that clearly is not going to be a good thing. So as much as anything, it's very much a case of using all of the different tools that the government has available to them, and that includes monetary, fiscal, and supply side policies, and trying to balance all of those things together to try to achieve the overall aims and objectives of stability, low inflation, economic growth, and low unemployment. So thinking about that, and thinking about the ways in which we might actually use some of these spending tactics, then the whole principle is about trying to encourage a greater and boost productive potential of an economy in the long run, so we can shift our long run average supply curve out to the right and improve the overall productive capability of our economy. Okay, so multi-choice questions for you to consider. I'll leave you to have a go at answering those. Just go through the process as we've talked about before, with some of the multiple choices of highlighting the one that you think is the most obvious one, and also try and explain your answer. So another one there where we're looking at trend rates of to encourage growth and national supply. Remember, in some cases, what these questions will ask you and what they're trying to find out is whether you understand the difference between supply side, fiscal and or monetary policy. Okay, so sometimes this might be a bit of a process of elimination for you to consider. Another example there of thinking about which combination of macroeconomic factors are most likely outcome where the economy has introduced some successful supply side policies. So give some thought to how that might affect those different areas: employment, inflation, and the deficit on the current account. And finally, another one in terms of cutting income tax. What would you consider that to be? A combination of one of those four examples there. So that's basically supply side policies. That's what we've looked at. Hopefully it all makes sense. It's starting to come together now. We talked a lot about different types of macroeconomic policy, the fact that we've got these conflicts going on, and also that there are a number of different options that we can consider, whether that's market-based supply side policies or whether it's interventionist. Obviously, it's almost always a case of looking at some of the strengths and weaknesses and also some of the conflicts and trade-offs that policymakers are facing, and that's what the government is facing every day in terms of where it's going to spend its money, how it's going to spend its money, and what the impacts of that money might and that spending or that investment might be. Okay, so thanks very much for listening once more, girls, and we'll catch up next time round.